Verisk's Emerging Issues, your source for vital market intelligence on the evolving risks and opportunities facing insurers and risk managers that can help inform product development and strategic planning. Verisk's Emerging Issues.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening. My name is Greg Scoblete, and I'm an analyst on the Emerging Issues team. It's my great pleasure today to be speaking with Tor Soltvedt. He's a principal analyst at Verisk's Maplecroft and one of the architects of Maplecroft's new Strikes, Riot and Civil Commotion predictive model. With a possibly contentious U.S. presidential election looming, we thought it was an opportune moment to connect with Tor to discuss civil unrest trends in the United States. So, Tor, welcome.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background before you joined Maplecroft, and some of what you currently do at Maplecroft.
Sure. So my background is really in international relations and Middle Eastern studies. So I started off studying politics and Arabic at the University of Edinburgh, and that's really what set me on a track towards the political risk industry. And then, more specifically, if we go back to late 2010, early 2011, that's when we had, the big wave of uprisings across the Middle East, known as the Arab Spring. And what happened around that time was that there was, an increase in demand for political risk analysts with a Middle East focus. And so that's really how I ended up joining Maplecroft in early 2011, just at the height of the Arab Spring. And the Middle East, it's still a part of my current role. But what I also do now, in my role as an associate director of Insurance Insight is really work with our different teams of country and regional analysts to provide political risk analysis for our insurance sector clients. And what we're seeing at the moment is that things like strikes, riots and civil commotion, or SRCC, and political violence more broadly are really pressing issues for a lot of insurers at the moment. And so it's a really interesting time to be covering these issues. And it's a really interesting role because I get to work very closely with a lot of different teams and a lot of different people across Maplecroft, and also increasingly within extreme event solutions and also Verisk more broadly.
For those in the audience who may not have heard of it, could you briefly explain your SRCC predictive model? How you built it, what it does, and who it's for?
Sure. So the model was developed by our analytics team, and it initially came together as part of the Lloyd's Lab Accelerator program, and that was back in 2021. And the aim was very much to come up with a solution and a tool that would help to mitigate the impact of some of the high impact loss events that we've seen around the world since 2019. So we had Chile in 2019, the United States in 2020, South Africa in 2021. There were the civil unrest events in France last summer, and then again in New Caledonia this year. So just those events alone, cost more than $10 billion worth in insured losses. And so that's what we're trying to help mitigate with the model. And really what we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years is really just an unprecedented rise in high loss, high impact civil unrest events around the world since 2019. So what the model does in that context is really to enable underwriters and exposure analysts, modelers, and also specialty reinsurers more generally to essentially forecast and monitor geospatial SRCC risk. And the short version of what the model does is that it predicts the severity of civil unrest events for all admin 2 areas around the world. So for the US, that would be at the county level. And currently our analytics team are working to downscale that further so that we can eventually get a granular, detailed SRCC score down to the block level. And so that's what we're working towards at the moment. And without getting too technical, the way that the model works is that it essentially uses an algorithm to estimate the number of properties that are damaged during civil unrest events. And then we then take those predictions and we validate them against actual insured losses. And we get that data from Verisk's property claim services. And then some of the other factors that are incorporated into the model are things like historic protest sizes for a particular location, and also socioeconomic and developmental factors. So these can be things like income inequality, inflation trends, unemployment trends, and so on. And so it's all of these kind of risk drivers and the log of historic protests that gives us a national level score for every country in the world, and then we can then downscale that further down to the local level based on the concentration of people and also economic value in those local areas.
When you look at modeling for potential unrest, now you mentioned some of the trends. Are there some that are more decisive than others? What kind of factors can really move the needle here?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because when it comes to something like civil unrest, arguably you could say that there's almost an infinite number of variables that can impact how individuals, governments, and societies behave in ways that ultimately lead people to take to the streets in protests, or in some cases violent rioting. So it's always going to be inherently more difficult to model something like civil unrest compared to, say, natural catastrophes. But in terms of our approach and the model, it's very much a mix of quantitative and qualitative analysis. So on the quantitative side with the model, when our analytics team developed the model, what they did was that they looked at a large number of potential predictors of damaging civil unrest. And unsurprisingly, the one thing that stands out the most is really the historical log of protests for a particular location. So, the frequency and the severity of recent and historic protests for a particular country and for a particular area. But there are also a number of other factors that were found to be predictive of damaging civil unrest. First of all, we have what we like to call contextual factors that relate to climate and development. So these are things like, the levels of income inequality in a country, poverty levels, the conduct of law enforcement and security forces, exposure to the impacts of climate change, for example. And then we also have another group which are kind of more dynamic socioeconomic trends. So these will be factors like monthly and annual changes in inflation and unemployment. And especially over the last 5 years or so, we've seen inflation being a really, really big driver of civil unrest around the world, perhaps less so now with inflation starting to come down in many parts of the world. And then on the qualitative side, it's probably fair to say that it's perhaps more of an art in the science. And so we have teams of thematic and regional and country analysts, and they really look at trends and developments that could be concerning from a civil unrest point of view. And so in that case, it's really a case of looking for specific events that could spark or trigger civil unrest. So examples of that could be, policy changes in a particular country that adds to socioeconomic pressure, and then in turn the risk of violent civil unrest. So things like energy subsidies being removed, which we're seeing in Nigeria at the moment, for example, or tax increases, something that we're seeing in a lot of countries around the world now, with rising concerns around government debt in many countries. I think it's important to stress that when it comes to forecasting and monitoring civil unrest risk, the hardest part is always going to be to try to predict exactly when civil unrest is going to ignite and exactly what is going to trigger it. But what we can do is we can use our teams of country and regional analysts to look for potential sparks and potential flashpoints. And then we know from the model what the underlying SRCC risk is for a given location around the world over the next 12 months. And so what that does is really tell us how dry the tinder is and how big the powder keg is for a particular location.
Interesting. So, and you mentioned climate there briefly as one of the factors, and I just wanted to drill in on that a bit, because we often hear that climate change may be a contributing factor to civil unrest. Sometimes that's, in the context of a food shortage, maybe triggering riots, or intense heat leading people to be maybe more predisposed to aggressive behavior. But, if we just focus in on the US specifically for a moment, do you see any potential for the climate to influence our sort of civil unrest profile, risk profile?
Sure. I guess first of all, I mean, climate is very much an important area of focus for us at Maplecroft, and we have a dedicated team of environmental analysts. So it's something that we look at very carefully across a number of political risk issues. And again, with the model specifically, climate change vulnerability is one of the main risk drivers that are included in the model. Precisely because of the potential for climate change to drive or intensify civil unrest. And then, when we think longer term, we know that things like food insecurity is a growing concern. We've seen examples of large scale protest movements around the world in Europe over things like farming regulations and agricultural reforms. We've seen that in India and Bangladesh as well. And so for the US specifically, what we can see from the model is that the data tells us very much that exposure to climate change is a risk driver in the case of the United States, and that isn't the case for all countries. But for the US specifically, the impact on the model is below the global average, and it isn't really among the top drivers of SRCC risk in the US. But at the same time, when we think about projected increases in temperature in many US cities, that is obviously a concern, and is worth mentioning that our environment team very recently published some data and some analysis showing that the US cities that are the most threatened by extreme heat are also the ones that are seeing the fastest population growth. So clearly from a civil unrest point of view, that is an interesting finding and something that is worth keeping a close eye on over the coming years and decades. And so we really don't know exactly how all of this is going to impact SRCC dynamics, but it is pretty clear that rising heat is something that has the potential to trigger or worsen bouts of civil unrest events in the US and in other parts of the world. And I think specifically that the concern is obviously that without adequate adaptation to rising temperatures, then things like overloaded grids, more frequent power cuts, slowed economic growth. These are obviously all potential impacts, and all issues that are concerned from a civil unrest point of view.
And I know the climate has kind of been a challenge for human civilizations for generations, across the scope of our history. But we do, I think, have a newer factor to contend with, and that is the rise of AI and AI-fueled misinformation and disinformation. Is obviously something we've been hearing a lot about since generative AI became a hot topic a couple of almost 2 years ago at this point. What do you think about the role of AI and AI-fueled misinformation and disinformation as a driver for unrest? Do you think that this could be a significant influence here when you look out at the US and beyond?
Yeah, so AI is a really interesting one. I mean, there's a lot of interest in it at the moment in a number of areas, but also within in the context of civil unrest. And sort of just trying to kind of unpack it a bit. I mean, what we do know is that social media very much has played an important role in turning local civil unrest events into nationwide events in many countries. We saw that in the United States in 2020, and we also saw that in Chile and in South Africa and France as well, and other big civil unrest events over the last 5 or 6 years. And we also know that there are plenty of examples of disinformation being used to fuel and spread civil unrest events. South Africa in 2021 is probably the best example of that. And then now, with sort of the emergence of generative AI, that is something that certainly adds another dimension to the spread of disinformation. And it's worth stressing that a lot of this is very new, so we don't know exactly how it's going to impact civil unrest dynamics in the longer term. But we're already kind of seeing signs that the increasing availability of tools to generate images and videos, and then their proliferation on social media, is something that very much could amplify the impact of disinformation, especially at a time when civil unrest risks are already pretty elevated. And there are some examples, from the last year that we can look to and that serve as a bit of a potential warning. We had some large scale civil unrest in Dublin last November, and then again in the UK this summer. And in both cases, there was very much an element of misinformation about the perpetrator of a serious crime being spread through social media. That was then, fanned by AI bots, which then potentially increased the spread and the intensity of the violence associated with those protests. So in terms of the US and the upcoming election, there is obviously, a concern that you have this underlying high risk of civil unrest events to begin with, and a negative trajectory in the run-up to the election. And in that context, and with a pretty politically charged period in and around the election, the potential for AI fueled misinformation is a concern, and something that our Americas team is watching very very closely. So that's perhaps a very long-winded way of saying that the answers to all of this is still pretty murky, but AI is one of the big emerging challenges when it comes to civil unrest risk.
Let's stay with the U.S. and the presidential election for a moment. It feels, at least qualitatively to an outside observer, that things are fraught, right, in the United States, and it feels like we're entering a period of heightened risk. What does the SRCC model tell us about the current and possible near-term future of unrest in the United States? With the presidential election in November and concerns about how that might unfold.
Sure. Yeah. So essentially, what we're seeing from the model on the US is kind of very much in line with what you just said there. We know that the US is currently ranked as the sixth highest risk country in the world on the model. And as I mentioned, the US is on a negative trajectory. It's one of 84 countries around the world that have seen an increase in civil unrest risk over the last year. And so really where that puts the United States right now is, pretty much a similar level to early 2020, just before the historically large and historically damaging protests in May and June of that year. And if we compare, how the model has performed on other high-risk countries, we see that the model correctly identified France as the riskiest country in Europe before the 2023 protests there. And then similarly, it found Bangladesh to be one of the highest risk countries in the world before the extensive civil unrest earlier this year there. So now the fact that the US is ranked as high risk than both of those two countries on the model, that is a concern, especially in an election year.
So is an election, a civic event like that, a national election, a kind of a worrisome flashpoint for unrest generally? I mean, is this one of the reasons why why the model's sort of blinking red, if you will?
Well, it's a very interesting question. In terms of the elections and civil unrest risk, that's something that has always been a lot of focus and research on. And I think it's very much fair to say that one of the reasons why there is such a strong focus on civil unrest risk in the US this year is very much because of the upcoming election, which is now very close. And clearly elections, they are always worth monitoring in relation to SRCC, especially when we're dealing with very contentious or very politically charged elections. But at the same time, and this might be counterintuitive, but in general, elections aren't really, or tend not to be, strong predictors of violent civil unrest. So when we developed the SRCC model, the analytics team looked at the predictive power of elections as one of the potential risk drivers to be included in the model, but ultimately decided to not include them because there wasn't really much of a historic correlation. So including elections into the model didn't really help improve the accuracy of the model. And this year we've essentially had an election super cycle. We've had half of the world's population participate in elections this year, and out of the 40 or so elections that have taken place so far this year, we've only seen 3 or 4 where there has been major unrest. So that conclusion that our analytics team essentially found when they developed the model, that has been borne out during this year's elections super cycle. And then also, I think it's worth kind of looking at the United States specifically and the historic record there. And what we see is that election-related violence tends to be pretty rare. And we obviously have the events of January 2021 with the storming of the Capitol. That, of course, underscores the potential for election-related unrest. But at the same time, it wasn't a major SRCC event in the sense that it didn't cause a lot of damage to private property. But clearly, it was at the same time, very indicative of a polarized political environment. And when we look at polling now, what we see is that in terms of levels of political polarization in the United States, that has continued to rise steadily, and it's probably now higher than during the last election. So the concern now is that there could be flashpoints in the run-up to, or during, or after the election that could spark arrest, and so it's worth emphasizing that although the election could be a focal point for unrest, the risk of damaging SRCC events isn't going to go away after the election.
Tor, I wanted to thank you so much for your time today. We have links to more information on Maplecroft and their SRCC model on our website. And Tor, thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much.
Verisk's Emerging Issues, your source for vital market intelligence on the evolving risks and opportunities facing insurers and risk managers that can help inform product development and strategic planning. Verisk's Emerging Issues.